Hey vinyl fans, we're back up here in the Vinyl Attic for another installment of 100 Albums That Matter. These are 100 albums that I personally have determined are important to have in your collection. Albums that have some sociological or musical significance, albums that help change things, albums that help open doors for people. And I'm very excited about the album we're talking about today. We're going back to the world of jazz and talking about an album that I discovered. This is how I discovered this album. I was had a teaching gig as a graduate student in London in the summer of 1991, where I discovered Jazz FM, this really great FM jazz station. I'd go to sleep listening to it every night, and I was falling asleep hearing this sort of wailing and screaming and these drums. I didn't know what it was, and I woke up and I called the station. And I'm like, "What did you play around midnight last night?" And it was Max Roach's Freedom Suite, We Insist, from 1960, December 1960. This is an album we're going to talk about today. We're talking about it right now because we're also doing this in honor of Max Roach's 101st birthday on Friday, January 10th. He would be 101. He lived a long time. He made it all the way to 2007. I remember the day he passed away. It was very sad. I'm a huge Max Roach fan, and I want to talk about this album and its significance, especially as we continue to talk about race in America, the issue of race in America. Max, one of the most famous drummers in jazz, got his start basically as a kid, filling in Duke Ellington's orchestra. Probably most famous. He's played with everybody, Miles and everybody, but probably most famous as being Charlie Parker's drummer on all those great sessions. Just a young cat playing with Bird. This record came together in a very interesting way because he was, part of the bop scene, the hard bop scene of the 1950s. And the civil rights movement was really kicking off. And so he and Oscar Brown, the great lyricist and singer, wanted to put together a piece to be released in 1963 in honor of the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that the slaves would be free. And they worked on it. They were working on it in 1960. In 1960, the civil rights movement just sort of took off, especially in Greensboro, the lunch counter demonstrations, which the cover was sort of a mimic of. Right before this record came out in November was the month that Ruby Bridges had to be escorted by federal troops to be able to go to school in Louisiana as they tried to desegregate the racist Jim Crow schools of the South. I mean, the 60s really start in 1960. The civil rights movement is up and running. And so he and Brown were working on it, and they were working on it. Max grew up or at least was born in a swamp in North Carolina, but was a New York guy. He was in New York. Oscar Brown was in Chicago, and they were writing it over the phone, kind of the way that people, like Taylor Swift and her co-workers, do things over the internet, write songs over the internet. They were writing over the telephone, and with the goal of getting this thing recorded and done by 1963. But because 1960, there was so much happening, Oscar kind of got frustrated with the pace of things. And Max said, I'm going to put this thing out. We're going to record this. We're going to put it out. The time is now. We cannot wait to make this statement. And the music on this is not like anything that you've ever heard before. And there are 5, it's sort of a suite. It's the Freedom Suite. And there are 5 sort of sections of it. And I thought I'd talk about each of these sections kind of individually because the urgency of the civil rights movement and the need to sort of change things while the door is open. This is the Kennedy administration. This is sort of a new opportunity to push things forward. Martin Luther King is becoming more predominant as a civil rights figure. There's sort of this urgency that's captured in this record. And so I wanted to kind of talk about each of the 5 sections individually. The first song is called Drive a Man, and it's the sound of the cracking of the whip. And it's not about the slave master as much as it is about the poor white guys the slave master would hire to make sure the slaves didn't get off the plantation. And sometimes they would be brutal. Sometimes they would be sexually brutal to slave women. And there is this sort of clap of the whip that's here. What makes this song really great is it features the saxophone of Coleman Hawkins, one of the greatest jazz saxophonists of all time, one of the innovators of bebop, somebody that Max Roach had worked with, brings Coleman Hawkins on to play on this song, and it really captures the terror of slavery. I should point out that this isn't an instrumental album. There's also the vocalization of Abbey Lincoln, who would later go on to be Max Roach's wife. Abbey Lincoln, also a film star. Seen her in a couple really great movies from back in the day. She was also the woman who helped pioneer the natural afro for African American women in the civil rights movement. I mean, Abbey Lincoln is this sort of monumental figure, civil rights leader, all on her own. Her voice appears as the slave to the crack, and Coleman Hawkins' saxophone is sort of the driver man. And so there's this great tension between them that captures that kind of intensity of slavery. The next track is Freedom Day, which is about the emancipation, what we now celebrate as Juneteenth. And it's meant to be uplifting, but also anxious. I mean, there's a lyric that is sort of like, are we really free? It says, rumors fly and must be lying. Can it really be? Can't conceive it, don't believe it. But that's what they say. Slave no longer, slave no longer. This is Freedom Day. So there is this anxiety, and it's sort of built into the music that Lincoln is sort of singing to this great jazz ensemble. The third piece, and this is what ends side one, is kind of the centerpiece for this album. It's the triptych that is called Prayer, Protest, Peace. Sort of three songs rolled into one. Prayer is this sort of wordless prayer from Lincoln, where there's just just her vocalizing this hopefulness that something is gonna change, and there's all the suffering and this bondage associated with slavery. There's also connections to what's happening in Africa. And it's just this aspirational, beautiful meditation. And then it goes into protest. And protest is sort of the most controversial part of the record. It's essentially Abbey Lincoln screaming. And it was seen as a rejection of Martin Luther King's peaceful message of, let's try to get along and win our seat at the table. It was defiant. It was dissonant. It was hard. It's hard to listen to. It's what I heard in the middle of the night listening to Jazz FM in London that night, and it is jarring to listen to. And I have to think, listening to this in the modern era, that this had to be an influence on Yoko Ono. I mean, Yoko Ono in 1960 was a young artist, young avant-garde artist. When this record was coming out in 1961, especially, I had to think that Yoko heard this and said, "Oh yeah, there is value in this sort of guttural screaming and catwalling and expressing pain and rage in a non-verbal, non-melodic kind of way." I wouldn't be surprised if you were to talk to Yoko today, who's still with us, and say, did We Insist play a role in your style? I think it did. And then it goes into the last piece, which is prayer, which is peace. The last piece is peace, which is the first time we actually get sort of a rhythmic track. Because most of the stuff is 5/4. It's very kind of, offbeat. We finally get kind of a simple rhythm in the peace part where she's sort of, coming to terms. But it's an uneasy piece, right? Because it's not like everything was solved in 1960. That there was emancipation, and then there was 100 years of terror to follow emancipation. So you get a sense of, yeah, the slave masters are gone, but we're still not there yet. Then we flip over to side two of the record. Side two is really interesting because what was happening in the world in 1960 was decolonization. That there was a lot of the world, especially the black world, that was shaking off the yoke of the colonial master and becoming free, including Nigeria, which won its independence in 1960. All over the world, there was this Afrocentric awareness that Africa is ascendant. Things like South Africa and apartheid in South Africa were getting a lot more attention. And so the second side really is kind of the world music side, if we can even say that. The fourth track is called All Africa. and it features the drumming of Olatunji. And Olatunji, I've always known Olatunji's name because he's mentioned in Bob Dylan's song "I Shall Be Free" on Free Will and Bob Dylan. What are you going to do about Olatunji? So I've always known about Olatunji, the drummer, and Olatunji helped to make African drumming very in vogue, if I can say that, in the early 1960s. I mean, I think my parents had an Olatunji record in their vinyl collection, if I'm not mistaken. In fact, I know they did. And so we get this sort of Pan-African picture on the fourth track, including this celebration of African nationalism. Abbey Lincoln sings the name of all the main tribes of Africa: Bantu, Zulu, Watusi, Ashanti. I mean, she just goes through the list of all the African tribes that have been colonized by Europeans, and there is this beautiful worldness. In fact, it also includes percussionists from Brazil and Cuba who are also part of the African diaspora. That they were, all the recipients of the slaves that are all sort of present on this one track to connect the motherland, Africa, and the land where people ended up in together in this one beautiful track. The last track on the album is "Tears for Johannesburg." This is a straight up protest song to bring awareness to the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa in 1960, where 91 people were killed, including a lot of children, and many more were injured. It's not, it doesn't have a lyric. It's a sort of jazz improvisation of the pain and the anger around apartheid and the murder of Black Africans in Africa by white settlers. And it is a way of bringing this record both to the present. Sharpeville had just happened in 1960, but also connect it back to the original idea of slavery and the unjustified subjugation of African people. And so there is this beautiful arc on this record that was put together just in these five tracks alone. This was not a popular record. It was not a commercial success. A lot of the critics scratched their head. They weren't sure what all the screaming and wailing was about. And I should say white critics. I think African American listeners kind of got it. There was an attempt to sort of spread the message on the record. In fact, the NAACP sponsored performances by Max Roach's band, including Abbey Lincoln, to perform this live and kind of explain what the songs were for white audiences. They're supposed to be, these hip jazz fans. So here's what's going on. People like you are oppressing us to this day, including at lunch counters in the South. Roach vowed that when this record came out, he would never play anything or never make a record that was not somehow socially conscious or make a statement about the world, including the great 1962 Speak Brother Speak, which I love this record. He continued throughout his career to make music that was really, reflective of a deeper experience and not just meant to sort of entertain people with sort of basic blues-based chords, but challenge them with things that were more Afrocentric. And he really inspired a whole generation of musicians to go back to Africa, in terms of inspiration of musical styles and lyrical themes and emotional content. So this record is, I mean, it even looks like a newspaper, right? I mean, this is it's meant to be like, this is happening right now. And we insist that you pay attention to it. I mean, how punk rock is that, right? We insist that you listen to this damn record and then feel inspired to go do something about this situation that you're living in right now, America, South Africa. And so in the wake of Black Lives Matter and the fact that these issues are still upon us, we insist that you listen to this music, that you make music like this, and you advocate and do everything you can to dismantle these forms of oppression. That's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to do with this music. Okay. Yeah, I love this record so much. It's almost like it came to me in a dream. I was asleep in London, half asleep, with this cool station on, and Abby Lincoln's voice and Max Roach's drumming was just beating into my brain. And I woke up the next day and I was like, what the hell was that all about? I need to find out. I need to find out. So thank you, Jazz FM in London, because you turned me on to this great. You got to get this record. Okay. Next, well, speaking of this era, we're going to talk about Dylan again. We got to talk about Bob Dylan. We got to talk about uh, a record that is kind of disparaged in the new Bob Dylan movie, um, a Complete Unknown, and that's Bob Dylan's 1962 debut album entitled Bob Dylan. We're going to talk about that next. I'm going to redeem that album and how it fits in with in a way they're kind of bookends. This is late 1960. That one is mid 1962. They sort of fit together, so it made sense to talk about Bob Dylan next. But this record, Max Roach, lived a long life. We loved him. We love him still. Happy birthday, Max Roach. Good God, this album matters. This album, in a way, not only helps spark the civil rights movement of the 1960s, but brings us world music, brings us Afrocentric music, including into hip hop. This record matters. This music matters. This all matters, and you matter. So let's talk about it.